evening, everyone. Thank you for being here, and welcome to all those tuning in online, especially to any Daughters of Charity or Vincentians that may be tuning in. Today we will be hearing about St. Vincent de Paul. My introduction to St. Vincent de Paul was as a little kid, always hearing about the Vincent de Paul Society doing this and doing that at the church that I grew up in. So it's a name that I'm familiar with, but this story not so much. So I'm looking forward to learning more about who this man of God is. And here, our trusty guide, Brother Joel Giallanza, Holy Cross brother, will be here to take us through St. Vincent de Paul's life and his teachings. And so if you have any questions, we'll have a question section at the end of this. If you're online, wherever you're watching it online, you can type in your questions either underneath if you're watching on Facebook, or on the website. There's a form underneath the video player. So thank you very much, and here is Brother Joel.
Thank you, Isaac. Can you hear me? Okay, because I can't hear myself. Good evening, everyone, and good evening to everyone online. As I've done with the others, I'd like to begin with the responsorial psalm for the Mass for the Feast of St. Vincent. Happy are those who fear the Lord, who greatly delight in God's commands. They rise in the darkness as a light for the upright. They are gracious, merciful, and righteous. They have distributed freely. They have given to the poor. Their righteousness endures forever. In one sense, it's easy to see why the Church would choose such a psalm for St. Vincent. As I mentioned when we looked at St. Francis of Assisi, St. Vincent de Paul is one of those saints that is not usually placed among the ranks of the mystics. But I included him in everything that we've looked at because he does contribute to an understanding of the Christian life, of building a relationship with God. And that touches spirituality, that touches mysticism. And in St. Vincent's case, especially in terms of the social dimensions of the gospel, being attentive to the poor, to those who are underserved or not served at all, and those who are completely neglected. Vincent lived in the 16th century in France, but he speaks of values and of priorities that did not become a permanent fixture within church teaching until much, much later. Vincent was born on April 24th, 1581, in Pouilly, which is a very small village in France, just north of the border with Spain. He was the third of 6 children of Jean de Paul and Bertrand de Maurras. They were of the peasant class. Growing up, Vincent would have known the reality of poverty. At least he would have known what it was like to not have everything you would like to have. Peasants in this time in France, and for actually almost 200 years later, they bore the weight of the taxation system. That's pretty much what the peasants had to do, because the clergy and the nobility were exempt from taxes. So there would be only one group, the peasant class, and what little bit there may have been of a middle class. They bore the weight of taxation. It truly was a system in which the rich got richer and the poor could only get poorer. 200 years later, in the same country in France, this will be part of the reason for the French Revolution. The pressure cooker, even in St. Vincent's time, was already building. I don't know your image, as Isaac mentioned, your image of St. Vincent today. Generally, it's that of a gentle, loving person who cared for others. Though he did not found the St. Vincent de Paul Society, the fact that his name is associated with the society and with all of the works that the St. Vincent de Paul Society does, it only adds to that image of gentleness, of generosity, of serving others. The truth is, Vincent only gradually became a person who was generous and loving. Initially, by personality, he was short-tempered and not easy to get along with. He himself said, without God's grace, he would have become, and these are his words, rigorous and repulsive, coarse and crabby. Not exactly someone you'd invite to supper. Not exactly someone you'd want to work with or hang around with. What was his ambition, this young man from the peasant class? It was to have the good life. He wanted access to things that he could not have when he was growing up because of the poverty of his parents, the poverty of his situation. He was not particularly drawn to pursue holiness, but he did have a good education. And in 16th, 17th century France, that eventually would move one from men, move them in the direction of seeking priesthood, because it would move them out of the situations they were in. So he was ordained in 1600 at 19 years old. You needed an exemption to be ordained that young, but it demonstrates what kind of student he was and how his professors and the bishop looked at him. Still, he continued to pursue his desire for the comfortable life. At the time, that was relatively easy for the priests to do because they received respect from the people and they received money for doing the things that a priest does. And it moved him out of the peasant class and the middle class. It's important to know, and for the next couple of hundred years, in France at the time, there were what is known as 3 estates, or another way to say it is 3 classes of people that made up society. I think it helps to understand why Vincent wanted to move. The first estate, as it was called, was the clergy. They were exempt from taxation because, as they said, they interceded with God on behalf of the country. So that's what we're giving to you. We're praying to God on your behalf. But the truth is, priesthood was a privileged position, and it didn't always necessarily involve prayer. The second estate included the nobility. They were tax exempt also and had extensive privileges because, as they said, they fought in wars to protect the country, to safeguard the country. But the truth of them, not all of them had ever fought in a war. Some did, but not all. The remainder of society was the peasant class, and that was the third estate. The peasant class, or what small middle class there was, it was by far the largest group. I know the numbers better for the 1800s than where we are this evening. In the 1800s, the clergy and the nobility were maybe total 200,000 people. The third estate was 27 million, and they paid the taxes. That was their privilege, to pay the taxes. You can see how it begins simmering, and 200 years later, it will explode into the French Revolution. But back to Vincent. 5 years after Vincent was ordained, he went to Marseille to receive an inheritance through family. He was to receive some money. On his return, he was captured by pirates, and he was sold as a slave in Algeria. Algeria is in northern Africa, but it was a French possession. It had French culture, it was French speaking. He managed to escape 2 years or within 2 years, and he went to Rome for further studies, for higher studies, even though he was ordained. He returns to France, and eventually he becomes chaplain to the Queen of France, Marie de Medici, who is the wife of Henry IV. Well, you can imagine, this is exactly the life he was looking for. Vincent thoroughly enjoyed life in the royal court. Being chaplain to the Queen, to be honest, you didn't have a lot of work to do. It was nothing like you see the work of parish priests. You maybe said a Mass a day, and every so often heard not confessions, the confession of the Queen. That was it. Maybe of the king, but the king often had his own chaplain, because usually in court life, there was more than one chaplain for different people. And sometimes monarchs could demonstrate how holy they were by how many masses they attended each day. And in those days, a mass was equated to the priest. So if you had 3 priests up here doing mass all at the same time, you attended 3 masses, which makes no sense to us. But it was like, oh, this is great. And sometimes they would cheat. One priest would begin at the beginning, one priest would do the reading, and one priest would do what we know as the consecration and communion all at the same time. So Mass was over in 10 minutes. But I went to 3 Masses today, and you say, that's ridiculous. Ah, well, that's why we have a few more liturgical laws today within the church. Nevertheless, he loved being chaplain to the Queen of France. But in addition, he also served as a tutor in the household of Count de Gondy. Count de Gondy was the general of all of the king's naval ships. This is maybe where we begin to see grace intervene in a very direct way. In the course of his duties to that household, so he would simply leave the palace and then make his way to this other household, he was serving as a tutor, maybe for the children, maybe for the servants, to learn how to read, to learn a little bit of writing. But in the course of that job, he heard the confession of one of the servants who was dying. And a servant, even though they would work in a noble household, they were of the peasant class. That experience of hearing that confession made Vincent keenly aware and sensitive to the spiritual and material needs of the poor. I don't know for a fact, but it may have been one of the first times since his own growing up that he really was confronted with that. That this is real. These people have real needs that are not being addressed. Gradually, he began to work with the poor in little ways, as much as his responsibilities allowed him to do. And he was a gifted preacher. So when he would speak in a parish, when he would speak in some other context, it began to draw crowds because he was an excellent speaker. Vincent was becoming a different person. He began to work with, and it was easy to do, since one of his bosses, besides being the Queen, was this military general in charge of all the ships. He began to work with the slaves on the ship to discover, did they need the sacraments, preaching the gospel, all of the things that could be done. Eventually, he sees himself as a chaplain to the slaves on the ships. And this is consuming more and more of his time. The wife of the count, the Contessa de Gondy, saw the effect of Vincent's work with the slaves, with these poor people. And she asked him to organize a group to work with the poor. which is extraordinary for a noble woman. Why would she be bothered? But we can never know completely the way God will work. And she asked her husband to supply the funds for it, for this group. At first, Vincent felt he simply wasn't worthy, given his own background, to be in charge of this group. But finally he agreed, and he founded first what we know today as the Congregation of the Mission. They're also known as the Vincentians, being named after St. Vincent. In France, they're known only as the Lazarists. It has nothing to do with Lazarus in the Gospel. It's named after a section of Paris still today, which is called Saint-Lazare, because there was an abandoned hospital there that was given to Vincent as a use for his headquarters. So they became known as the Lazarus. It's very much like in this parish is Holy Cross. It has nothing to do with the crucifix. It's a neighborhood in France. So we got named Holy Cross, so we got the name. The same with the Vincentians in France, who are known as the Lazarus, after this place that they all came from, that they were all sent out from. This group began to grow very rapidly. Vincent organized parish groups, and he called them confraternities, and they were to work exclusively with the poor. He really wasn't doing much anymore of the other chaplaincy work. This became his life work. He would beg from the wealthy to support all the projects he was taking up, and he worked constantly to reduce the brutality to which slaves were subjected. He became quite an advocate for those who were in slavery. Of course, these confraternities, as he called them, these groups that work with the poor, were men and women, and they were growing. So one of his principal collaborators in this was a widow by the name of Louise de Marillac. She organized the women who were part of these confraternities, and more women became involved in the work. Eventually, they asked, and Vincent wrote a basic rule of life for them, a way that they could do their work and live in response to the gospel. That group eventually develops into what we know as the Sisters of Charity today. And they were in hospital administration and varieties of kinds of work around the world. At this time in France, and this is very forward-looking, at this time in France, sisters lived in convents. Yeah, you could say sisters live in convents today, but they didn't leave, really. It was a life of prayer. That wasn't going to work for Vincent and Louise. It simply wasn't going to work. The poor are out there. And so that was the approach he wanted to take. Vincent said, they are called Sisters of Charity. Their convent will be the sick room. Their chapel will be the parish church. Their convent where they live will be the city streets. And that's what they did. They would go out and serve the people on the streets. They were to be apostolic so they could be in direct relationship with the people. So the poor were no longer just a theory. Now they had people serving them. Vincent's work and his continuing fundraising helped to develop hospitals, urban and rural relief programs, assistance to victims of war. He ransomed more than 1,200 slaves from Africa, because it costs money to do that. You would simply have to buy a slave and free them. He continued that work until the end of his life. Clearly, Vincent had become a different man. Louise, too, continued her work. Louise died on March 15th, 1660. She was 69 years old. She was canonized in 1934, and she was proclaimed the patroness of social workers in 1960. Vincent died just 6 months after Louise, on September 27th, which is his feast day, in 1660. He was 80 years old. He was canonized in 1737. He was proclaimed the patron of all charitable groups in 1885. He's the patron of all charitable institutions and organizations, hospitals, those with leprosy, prisoners, those who ask for spiritual help. Of course, he's the patron of the St. Vincent de Paul Society and of all volunteers. He's symbolized in art often with children. You'll see St. Vincent standing and children near him because they were particular victims of poverty and neglect of society. Just as a note, the Vincent de Paul Society was not founded until 1833 by Blessed Frederick Ozanam, also a Frenchman. He was a great admirer of St. Vincent. And so when he founded this society that would commit itself to serving the poor and supplying material needs of the poor, he dedicated it to St. Vincent. Also, Blessed Frederick Ozanam was a close personal friend of Blessed Basil Moreau, the founder of the Congregation of Holy Cross. Father Moreau was so taken by the St. Vincent de Paul Society, as far as I know, he's the first one in France to have a confraternity of St. Vincent de Paul Society, as it's called, on a school campus, so that the students were members of the society and would go out and serve the poor. Vincent's feast is September 27th. The gospel is from St. Matthew. Jesus went about all the cities and villages teaching, proclaiming the good news, curing every disease. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. He said to his disciples, "Ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into the harvest." I think that expresses very well Vincent's call from God and his response to God. Well, what do we take from St. Vincent? Vincent primarily teaches us that charity involves action. It can never merely be a fine theory or eloquent words. And if we're honest, maybe not ourselves personally, but we know that can happen. We can speak charitable and all the things that need to be done. But for Vincent, unless it's put into action, as we see in his own life, it counts for nothing. Vincent distinguished almost at least two kinds of love. One he called affective love, a love that I freely give to another person. We see it parents with children, spouses, close friends. It's an affective love. It's an experienced love. But he also speaks of effective love, a love which is given because the other person needs it, because the other person asks for it. It's not just like a free gift from me. I do it because it must be done. And Vincent says, it's this kind of effective love that I'm talking about. I see something that needs to be done, and I have no choice but to do it because I love, because that's what Jesus taught. We know, I think Vincent challenges us, it's easy to feel charitable. It's easy to discuss possible solutions to situations in which people find themselves. But we can discuss that and walk away from it all. I've been in meetings, and maybe you have, I've been in meetings where something very important has been discussed. The discussion ended without any real action being taken, but everyone felt we addressed the issue. Of course, the issue was there tomorrow. But we discussed it, didn't we? Yeah, but Vincent would say, and what are you going to do about it? That's effective love, as he understood it. We can discuss the situation of the poor and the neglected or the abused. And what can we do about it? Vincent, so sometimes we make the mistake and we paralyze ourselves because we feel we can't do anything because the issue is so big, we don't do anything. And yet Vincent would call us, you just do what you can. You just do what you can. Vincent would say that whatever efforts I make, however tiny, God will bless them. Because otherwise that little effort, however small it may be, it's not unimportant and it's needed. It may make no sense to say it this way. We're called to do what we can do because we cannot do what we cannot do. If I can't do it, I can't do it. But not to leave it there. And so what can I do? And that's where Vincent challenges us. Discover what I can do and then do it. Otherwise, I'm forever trapped in the cycle that says, well, I can't do it. And so I do nothing. When in fact, I may be able to do something. It's not the size of what's done. It's the love with which it is done. That's Vincent's call to us. Vincent's life and work are a testimony, at least we know, from this simple confession that he heard. We have no idea what came up in that confession, but it was a confession of a dying person, a dying peasant. And his life seems to begin anew. So from that point, his life and work are a testimony to concern for the poor. And for him, that was simply a matter of justice. He has this wonderful line, all things are part of the goods of God, and we are only dispensers of them. And so from them, we should take only what we need. It's the beginning of a spirituality of conservation, the beginning of a spirituality of ecology. Everything are gifts from God, and we're only dispensers. That's very different than being a safety deposit box, where I take and just keep it and never use it for the good of others. Vincent doesn't see us as safety deposit boxes, but as dispensers. And I take only what I need. Because if I take more than that, someone who has needs won't have what they need. Vincent wasn't responsible for the situations personally, necessarily. He might say he had some contribution by the way he lived, but he wasn't responsible for such conditions existing in society. But he refused to sit still in a society that just was comfortable ignoring it. He had to do something. And he simply did what he could do. That's all the gospel asks us to do. Do what I can do. That call hasn't changed over the centuries at all. Another significant dimension of Vincent's life and work was his practice of involving the laity. Well, we can almost take that for granted today. I mean that in a good sense, the way the church is structured and the way the church, if it's going to be successful like a St. Ignatius, you need everybody. You need everybody. Even after the establishment of the Vincentians and the Sisters of Charity, Vincent realized they couldn't do everything. Even they needed help too. And so that's part of organizing the groups of the laity. Not just the Vincentians or just the sisters could get to every poor person. It wasn't going to happen. We needed to infiltrate society much, much more. So when the St. Vincent de Paul was founded, that's why Blessed Frederick Ozanam created those confraternities as you see it today. That was the way to be present finding out the needs of the people. When we combine Vincent's concern for the poor and his involvement of the laity, we have a very rich sense of church. That was not completely the sense of church in the 16th and 17th centuries. It's almost a people of God sense of church. That's exactly how the church sees itself today. We are church. That really wasn't language that was used in Vincent's time, but yet what he's doing is precisely that. You have a contribution to make too. We know that now. That wasn't such a common way of thinking. Oh, let the priest do it. Let the sisters do it. It's not going to happen that way. Regardless of the amount of religious vocations, it's not going to happen that way. We're church, and we're the ones who respond. Because all of us are called to continue Jesus' mission, not just a few people. If we don't continue the mission, how will it be done? How will the gospel be preached? How will the needs of the people be served? Nothing about the mission is theoretical. From Vincent's perspective, either it is done concretely or it simply doesn't exist. It can't exist on the level of just words. The mission can only be seen by its incarnation into action. I think that insight is a gift to us from St. Vincent. Vincent certainly understood that engagement in the mission involves a relationship with God. And part of that is prayer. For Vincent, the two were blended. This was also something that was happening in 17th century French spirituality. The two were blended. You can see the way he's working among the poor, doing what he's doing. It's the only way he could understand how prayer and the work involved in the mission could be connected. Our prayer, our relationship with God, and our service merge from Vincent's perspective. For him, even if our service were to disrupt our prayer, God will bless it. Now, that's not saying we just neglect prayer. He's not saying that. But if our service disrupts our prayer, God will bless it. Because our relationship with God and our service of others are equivalent. Basically, Jesus says the same. But Vincent begins to struggle with, well, I can't ignore the needs that are out there because, excuse me, I'm going to pray. That really wouldn't make sense to him. I pray and I serve. And if service some days consumes all of my time, God makes up the difference. That, too, I think is a gift to us from St. Vincent. We live in a world, we know this, of increasing disparity between the rich and the poor, between those who can do things and those who cannot. We may not be able to change, and that becomes the challenge. I may not be able to have a definite impact, a lasting impact on all of the political and social situations that cause that disparity, but that does not mean I can't do anything. I have to find out whether it's talking or writing to a representative, whatever it may be, involving myself in the church in some service project, whatever it may be. What I think is important is that we discover what contribution we can make. It's important to know, and you know this because it doesn't happen until centuries later, Vincent, with all the work he did among the slaves, he died. He never lived to see the abolition of slavery, but he continued to do it. The attitude could have been, this is just like a pile of ants. It's never going to end. So why waste my time on it? That was never his approach. He knew even as he was serving slaves, there were more slaves being created. Even as he's serving the poor, there were more poor being born. but I have no choice. It's what the gospel calls me to do. A significant challenge that he gives to us, whatever we can do and whatever we do, we have to be at peace that we may not see the results of it in our own lifetime. And that is no cause for not doing it. That too is a gift from Vincent. He didn't see completely the fruit of all of his work. And that may be true for many of us. I think especially people who are in teaching, hospital ministry. Just reflect on your own work. You know, I finished with one. Here we are at the end of a school year. I finished with one group of students. It starts all over again. I can rejoice that one patient leaves the hospital and 3 more just came in the emergency room. It'd be easy to say, and especially we know the pressure that was on all of the COVID people who served, doctors and nurses. It would have been so easy to say, this is insane, I'm out of here. But we know so many stories where they did not do that. And they don't know, like us, they don't know when the exact end of it will be. We may be beginning to see some light at the end of the tunnel. But it's true also for the mission of Jesus. It will keep coming. It will keep coming. I do what I can as I can. Vincent's life is most certainly not calling us to do everything that he did. That's the truth for all of the people we have looked at. They're not calling us to live their life. But his life does call us to identify what can I do in response to this situation. It cannot be merely observation, and it cannot be simply conversation. It has to be action. What can I do? That doesn't take away from my primary responsibilities to work and family, because then that doesn't work either. I can't ignore my family and say, oh no, I'm going to be at St. Ignatius every night doing something. That isn't going to work. It might end in divorce, but what's the point of it then? No, that's not what we're called to do. I have to sit down and figure out, these are my primary responsibilities. My relationship with family, my relationship with God. What is it that I can offer? What is it that I can do? I think what we find in Vincent is a mysticism, a spirituality of action. That wasn't really spoken about in his lifetime, but we see that. We see an apostolic mysticism, a mysticism that finds God present in the most complex of situations, not just in church. This is important, but out there is also important, an apostolic mysticism. And most certainly in Vincent, we find a mysticism of justice. What is it that I have? And I'm not just talking about material goods. What gifts do I have? What abilities do I have? What insights do I have? What is it that I can have? What is it that I have that I can share with others to make life, to make society, to make the world just a bit better? I don't need to spend my life on the needs of the world. I can be content with my neighborhood, with my family, with my parish. Then I'm making an actual impact. I can speak about saving the world and do nothing. But I can commit myself to do something here and now. I think that's the challenge of Vincent, and that's why he has endured as a model for so many people. And for me, that does put him in the rank of the mystics, one who builds a relationship with God based on the generosity, the kindness, the compassion they have for others. Well, let me finish here and see if you have any questions. But just before I finish, I want to say thank you who have come, and I thank the people online. I want to especially thank Isaac for organizing all of this and getting the handouts ready and all of that. for Father John for letting us use the building. So I just wanted to say that as we kind of finish. But if there are any questions or comments?
And if you have any questions, please stand up and you can remove your mask and speak, and then I'll repeat your question into the microphone for our audience online. So the question is, other than the confession that he heard of the dying slave, was there anything else going on in St. Vincent de Paul's life that played into this kind of moment of grace, of conversion?
I think just as he was working with the poor more and more from this, once that awareness hits, and in some way he must have asked the question, what can I do? Using the word can very literally. What am I capable of doing? What do I have the ability to do? I think it simply drew him in more and more. So that whatever his image was, of the good life in court life, that just did not sustain him anymore. So I don't know if there were particular moments, but we hear it so often of people helping out in something and then allowing it, still being responsible to all they have to do, allowing it to consume them. And I think that's often the way that grace works. It draws us in, because I find I can do this without violating any of my primary responsibilities. Because there's no aspect of the spiritual life, none, that would justify a violation of a primary relationship. I don't neglect my children so I can go work at the parish. I don't do that. I don't neglect my spouse. I don't neglect my work responsibility. Spiritual life just doesn't work like that. And that's what I think the gift from Vincent is, to accept the challenge, to say, given this that I have to do in my life, to feed my family, to do whatever, what still can I do? And I think it drew him in more and more, so that he simply, by the end of his life, you can imagine someone who's in court life, for example, would have been dressed very well. By the end of his life, the sisters are talking about, we're always, putting patches on his cassock because it's just falling apart. I don't need a new one. Even when he was sick in a cold French winter, he did not want much wood on the fire, because others have a right also. And you could say, well, that's kind of crazy. No, it's the way he actually saw it. He wasn't going to try to make himself sick, but it just drew him in completely, so that he would look at everything he would use, from clothing to firewood to food, so that he didn't want any more of this imbalance, so he could balance it as much. Does that help a little bit? Yeah, I think grace draws you in, but it was just in this instance, this confession opened that door. And because he was building his life so that I think God would have had a hard time knocking on the door and being heard. And he needed something very pastoral to kind of break open the egg thing.
We did have a question from online. How was Vincent able to leave his chaplain duties to the Queen to focus on the group helping the poor that the noblewoman had requested him to make? And were you allowed to just quit a position like that without getting in trouble or facing other consequences?
I think the fact that came through his work as a tutor in the military general, the military person who was in charge of all the king's naval ships, I think since it came through that, it worked better. Besides, you didn't necessarily stay chaplain to the king or the queen for the whole of your life. And I didn't myself find exactly when that ended, but it most certainly was through the military general, and especially his wife, telling her husband, you're going to supply the money for this group. So he definitely must have touched her also in some way, that she would say, we have a lot of resources. Of course he would have resources. He works directly for the king in a significant position, and so that can be used. Anyway. Well, thank you all. John. Exactly. You can.
Yeah, so the question is, within Holy Cross, they caution you about having the view of having your work be your prayer. And it seems like St. Vincent de Paul is sort of giving you permission to kind of enter into that. And I guess the question is, can you speak to those two different approaches and how they may be harmonious or may not be harmonious?
Actually, Father Moreau was highly admired Vincent, and that's one of his heroes, because I made the statement, if my prayer is disrupted by my work. Vincent wouldn't see them as equivalent either. It's, to me, I think, parish workers, most certainly among religious, I'll be honest with you, it's one of the great heresies, I'm using the word loosely, heresies of the 20th and 21st century, to do exactly what Father John is saying. You know, my work is my prayer. So Father John, Father Carl, Father Felipe could say, you know, heck, I say Mass every day, I don't have to pray. No, that's not, it doesn't work that way. I still have to have that personal, yes, a relationship with the Eucharist, but also a personal relationship with God. So what's new in Vincent is that I cannot dismiss my prayer because of work. But there will be those moments when at the last minute you want to be quiet for prayer, you want to do something, but you're called to the hospital. Go to the hospital, you know, for an emergency or whatever. Someone's dying. And that's, God blesses that. You have not sat down and said, I'm not going to pray because I'm too busy. Neither does Vincent, and neither does Father Moreau. We've created, unfortunately, there are times we create it. And the more I work for church, to be honest, the greater the temptation, because I work for church, you know. And so, I don't know if I have to pray so much. So I just wanted to clarify that. It's yes, there will be moments when the work I'm involved in, I have to be sure that it doesn't become chronic. But the work I'm involved in pushes prayer out of the way. And both Vincent and Moreau would say, that's fine, but that's not to be the pattern. That's not to be the pattern. If it becomes a pattern, I have to look at my life and figure out, how did this get so far out of balance? Because I really can't minister. Vincent couldn't do what he did if he didn't have a pretty strong relationship with God. That's still true today. I will eventually be completely drained and have nothing to offer to the people if I don't pray.
Another good question online is part of what unites all of these figures as mystics, the characteristic that they could see outside or beyond the conventional structures of the church or forms of religious life.
Ask that again. I didn't hear the first part. I'm sorry.
So is part of what unites all of these mystics we've been looking at the fact that they can see sort of beyond just the structures that of the church or society or religious life that's in front of them in that moment?
And the interesting thing, you're exactly right, or at least the questioner is exactly right. One of the interesting things is that these people we've looked at are actually blessed, but in a certain way, all of them pushed what was the usual way of doing things. Vincent most certainly did. with the Sisters of Charity. The Vincentian priests were priests involved as priests are today, but the sisters were not, they lived together, but they weren't, let me use the image, locked in convents. They had to be out on the streets with people. They had to be in the homes. They had to be in hospitals. That was really pushing a lot, actually, of what was the usual way of doing things. And part of the way Vincent dealt with that is the Sisters of Charity never took vows permanently. They renewed them every year. So they just renewed them every year. And it wasn't exactly the same as saying, okay, you're a permanent member. They were permanent members. But it was a way of getting, kind of doing an end run. I find that in a certain way with all, we saw it in Catherine, the way Catherine did certain things. Most certainly the way Francis chose to do certain things. They all did end runs. And so Vincent did too. It was a way to say, how can I get certain things done with the resources I have at my disposal? And fortunately, even though he himself was poor, he ended up having resources at his disposal because of the people he knew and the things he could get accomplished. So, yeah, they definitely thought outside the box, in a certain way. I'm almost tempted to ask
So for those online, the question is, how did St. Vincent de Paul energize the laity? Because that seemed like part of what he was trying to get at. Yeah.
I think, particularly among people who would have had resources. So we're talking about the nobility, and probably the truth is even the clergy. Because the clergy, I'm not talking about today, we're talking about the 17th century. They could live a very isolated way of life. Once I expose people to the reality, I think Vincent truly believed this and did it. If I can expose you to the reality, can you simply just go home and go to bed at night and say, I can't do anything for this person who doesn't have food or has no access to medical care, whatever it might be. I really think, remember I said one of the things he was effective at is preaching. I don't think Vincent was a preacher of theory. I think he was saying, go walk around the neighborhood and see who you see on the streets because they have no place to live, or people who are lining up to get bread or lining up at a hospital hoping some nurse or some doctor or whatever it was in those days would look at them. That's really the method. It's why I said it's the social dimension of the gospel. It's not to make people feel guilty. That's not the point of it. Because if we have certain blessings, there are blessings. There are gifts from God. It's not about making people guilty. It's about making people aware and saying, so what can you do without in any way violating, again, primary responsibilities to my family, most certainly my children, my employer, et cetera, et cetera. I have to be fair. And yes, when we line all those up, it may not let me a lot of time, but at least I can still ask the question. Or can I mobilize others? Vincent most certainly knew he couldn't do everything. So that's part of mobilizing others. I may not be able to do it myself, but can I support in some way? I think the church has, well, let me be honest, I think it probably varies from parish to parish. Every time, I don't know if you had one in 2020 because of COVID, I don't remember. But when there's Ministry Sunday here, I walk in and I'm going, this is really bizarre. So many things going on in this parish. Bizarre in a good sense, of seeing all of the organizations. And that's not to say, oh great, we don't have any more to do. We know that's not true either. But we can rejoice in that And to me, that's part of this energizing aspect, is you look at all of those different banners, all of those ministries, and I think Father John has said it, surely there's one little thing you could look at and go, you know what, let me at least go find out what that group's about. Maybe I have something I can offer. A little bit of time here, or a little bit of service to do something. That's how I think the church is hoping to operate anyway. Well, thank you all again so much for coming. Maybe we'll cross paths again, so thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all very much, and thank you, Brother Joel, for your time, being very generous with your time. And thank you all for tuning in online or coming here in person. And I guess stay tuned for what could come next.